Hi peeps, happy Tuesday, welcome back. Today I'm going to be reading chapters 2 and 3 from our book, The Enemy Above. Like I said in the other video, chapters are going to be different lengths. So yesterday chapter 1 was pretty long, but in my point of view, chapters 2 and 3 are pretty short. So we're going to be doing that today. Make sure by the end of the video today that you tell me your chapter titles for 2 and 3. Make sure that you're not just telling me your chapter title, you're telling me why you chose that chapter title, because I want to make sure that you are listening to me read in these videos. Okay, so make sure that you have your orange booklet. If you don't, then just grab, like I said, a random piece of paper with a pencil to have that ready for you. I'm going to be reading chapter 2, and my honey is going to come in and read chapter 3 with us. Like I said, they're pretty short, so I hope you enjoy. And just as a reminder, chapter 1 had ended with Anton, his grandma, which we call Bubby, and his 2 uncles were gathering everything they could in their house and leaving because they knew the Germans were coming, and they wanted to hide from them. And the chapter ended with Anton's Bubby saying, "You need to hide, they're here, they're here." So that was kind of like that cliffhanger for us in chapter 1. So without further ado, here is chapter 2. Major Karl von Dusen, remember that he's not a good person, stood in the back of the half-track, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. The darkness in the vehicle's rough, jostling ride made it difficult to see anything. If he spotted any type of movement, he would order the driver to stop. Then he could focus the lenses on whatever was running. That is what the Jews were doing, running. And those who had chosen not to run, those who thought they could stand against the might of the Third Reich, they were no longer a problem. Major von Dusen smiled. It had been a glorious day for him. His mission had been so successful, he wondered if he might be given another promotion. If so, he would become the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Gestapo. As the terrain grew more uneven, the half-track's front tires rolled over every stone, and its back treads bounced across every bump. Von Dusen dropped the binoculars and let them hang around his neck. He had volunteered to take a small unit to do some reconnaissance, which means that you are observing something that's going on. Many of the Jews in the area had waited until the last moment, believing the blitzkrieg would fail, that somehow the pitiful Polish resistance fighters could oppose or halt the greatest army in the world. Now they were running, and that made them careless, easy to catch. Still, the Germans were vulnerable. The Russian army still sat far to the east, but partisan forces and militias ran wild through the countryside. The militias were dangerous. They were composed of reserve soldiers from the Russian army who were older, or perhaps too sick to fight, but they had weapons, and they were organized. The partisan fighters were less of a threat to German forces. They were mostly civilians who opposed the current Ukrainian government for cooperating with the Reich. A bunch of university students and poets, self-described intellectuals who ran around the countryside pretending to be soldiers. Karl von Dusen did not fear them, but he would remain vigilant. Even bookworms could stage an ambush. The headlights of the half-track cut sharply through the gloom. It was a cloudy, moonless night, but they had passed an empty farmhouse a few kilometers back. It had belonged to Jews, but now it was deserted. And tellingly, the mezuzah was gone. A mezuzah was a small container that observant Jews attached to the doorpost of their homes, containing special verses from the Torah written on parchment. But at this house, the mezuzah had been removed. Von Dusen knew that meant the occupants did not intend to return anytime soon. Yet the ashes in the fireplace had still been glowing, and the wood stove was warm. Whoever lived in the house had fled only recently, which meant that more than likely they were still nearby, and Major von Dusen would find them. Up ahead, 2 dirt roads crossed each other. A flash of movement in the wheat field near the intersection caught the major's eye. He tapped the driver on the shoulder. "Halton," he said. The driver hit the brake. "Engine," he commanded. The driver turned the vehicle off. When the motor sputtered to a stop, Van Dusen listened carefully. He heard nothing, so he waited. There was no chirp of insects or call of night birds. Perhaps the noise of the half-track had scared them away. And if the rustling he'd seen wasn't coming from the animals, it could only mean one thing. Someone was nearby. Arms, he said. His driver and the 2 other men he brought with him took up their rifles and exited the vehicle. Van Dusen removed the Luger pistol from the holster at his belt. Fan out, he and his sergeant, a man named Eberhardt, took the right side of the half-track, and the driver and another private took the left side. Slowly they crept forward, stepping lightly and listening for anything that sounded out of place. Van Dusen's pulse quickened, and he tried to slow his breathing. There was someone close by. He was sure of it. Forward, he whispered. The 4 of them moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. He flicked on his flashlight. They walked along the road until they reached a place where he thought he'd seen something move. Here, he whispered. He shone his light on the wheat field and spotted several crushed stalks, bent as if someone had recently stepped on them as they passed through. Form up, he said. The 4 men made a long line along the road facing the field. With hand signals, Major Van Dusen motioned them forward. He kept the Luger pointed straight in front of him. They entered the field, single file, the others switching on their flashlights. Van Dusen was sure someone was close by. He could feel it. He wished he had brought a dog with him. The dogs were exceptional at tracking runners. Cautiously, the men inched forward. Van Dusen swept the ground ahead of him with his flashlight. He was not afraid of the Jews. They didn't fight back. But if resistance or militia fighters were nearby, the Germans' light could give them away. Watch the tree line, he ordered. If you see anything moving, shoot. He followed the tramp-down trail through the wheat field. Someone had definitely come through here, but by the time they had almost reached the tree line, they had yet to spot anyone cowering in the field. Perhaps the runners had rushed across the field earlier and were long gone. No, he was sure someone was close by. He could sense their fear. If you are here, he called loudly, you must show yourself. I promise you will not be harmed. That's a lie. There was no reply. Spread out, he said quietly. The men widened the gap between them. Van Dusen waved them forward, and they crept along, listening for their prey. But they heard nothing. Suddenly, Van Dusen thought he heard what sounded like a human gasping for breath up ahead. He held up his hand, and his men stopped instantly. Were his ears playing tricks on him? No, he was certain he had heard something, a noise that did not belong in a wheat field in the middle of nowhere. Slowly, he snuck forward, his pistol raised. He swept the gun back and forth in front of him. They were about 25 meters from the tree line. He carefully examined the ground, expecting to discover a group of terrified Jews huddled together, cowering in fear. But he saw nothing. Where had they gone? The Germans were now at the tree line. He glanced behind him. Had they missed these mystery Jews somehow? Unlikely. He turned his attention to the forest ahead and considered his options. There were many more places to hide in the woods. He should have brought along the dogs. Major? Sergeant Eberhardt asked. He was waiting for orders. Major Van Dusen holstered his Luger. We will return to camp. Tomorrow, when we have the light on our side, we will come back and pick up the trail, he said. The 4 men returned to their half-track and turned it back toward the east. It zoomed away in the night. All right, so this is a good spot to pause me and think about a chapter title before you hear my honey read chapter 3. Okay, so all this happening in chapter 2 right now, that's all that Anton saw while he was hiding with his grandma, Bubby. He saw all of this happening. Okay, so pause me right here and think about a chapter title before we read chapter 3. Oh, you want to sit here?
Chapter 3. Silence was life. Stillness was freedom. Anton turned his head to the dirt so light would not reflect off his face. He curled his body tightly and tried to control his breathing, certain he was going to be discovered. As the sound of the half-track grew nearer, he and Bubby had hurried toward the tree line, but his grandmother had slowed them down. Behind them, he could hear the engine stop and the men leave the vehicle. He heard orders barked in German. "Bubby," he whispered, "cover yourself with dirt." The soil was damp from the recent rains. He dug his hands into the ground and smeared his face and hands with mud. He helped his grandmother cover hers and pulled her shawl up around her face. "When the soldiers come, you must make yourself as small as possible and keep your face turned to the ground," he said. "Be brave, my kinder," she said. He watched his grandmother curl herself into a ball. Many years of hard work on the farm had made her stiff, and she grunted with the effort. Anton lifted his head slightly and studied the four men. They were spreading out along the road, and he heard automatic weapons being cocked. The noise of the guns carried across the field so loudly, he felt as if the sound was cutting through him. When the Gestapo entered the wheat field, he ducked down, burrowing into the ground as best he could. "I must not look," he thought to himself. "I must not look." He repeated the words over and over in his mind. Anton focused on the sound of the approaching men. Their boots whispered through the wheat stalks. He wondered if he and Bubby had somehow been spotted. The approaching vehicle had caught them by surprise. Anton willed himself to total stillness, praying that he would make himself invisible. To Anton, the men's footsteps sounded louder than cannon fire, and he was certain his heart would explode. The voice of one of the soldiers startled him so much he nearly cried out. Bubby spoke several languages. Because of the war, he was not able to attend school. But Bubby had been teaching his lessons, and for the past several months she had been instructing him in German. So far, he could understand and write it better than he could speak it. He heard the man ordering him and Bubby to show themselves, telling them that they would not be harmed. Anton wondered how this could be true. Their guns said otherwise. Silence was life. Despite the cool night air, Anton was sweating. He could not believe the men did not hear his heart hammering in his chest. He tried to keep his breathing regular, but it was difficult because he was so afraid. The men were moving again. They would be upon him in moments. Should he run? Should he take Bubby by the arm and make a break for the trees? No. They would never make it. The soldiers would gun them down before they had taken more than a step. The soldiers inched closer. One of them was only meters away. The man's steps sounded like thunder. Anton desperately wanted to look, but he did not dare. Stillness was freedom. Every muscle in Anton's body tensed as he readied for rough hands to grab him and jerk him to his feet. But the man passed him by. Anton could hear him moving toward the trees. The soldier had walked right between him and Bubby, huddled a couple meters apart, and not seen either of them. What should they do? Would the men enter the forest? If they did, should he and Bubby try to escape? Instinct told him to remain still. A few moments later, he heard the soldiers talking among themselves. They spoke in hushed, hurried tones. He could not hear well enough to understand, but he could tell that a decision had been reached. He glanced up quickly to see the men turning back and heading in his direction once again. Surely he and Bubby would be discovered. Closer they came. But this time they were not as cautious. They hurried through the field and returned to the half-track. Anton heard the engine start and the vehicle roar away in the night. He and Bubby waited a few more minutes, then stood up. Bubby groaned with the effort. She picked her way across the field slowly, taking sharp breaths as her joints creaked. Anton wished she would move faster in case the Nazis returned. He took her by the arm to steady her while she walked. "You are a good boy, Kinder," she said, patting him on the wrist. "Thank you, Bubby," he said. "We must hurry." "They will not return tonight," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I am old and wise. But my hearing is still young," Bubby cackled with laughter, "and my German is better than yours." Anton had to smile, but as they made their way toward the shelter of the woods, Anton couldn't help looking over his shoulder.
What if cliffhanger? This book has so many cliffhangers, which kind of makes you want to tune in tomorrow. Actually, no, tomorrow we're not doing it. It's Rootwood Wednesday packet. So tune in Thursday for chapters 4 and 5. All right. Take time to think about chapter titles. Make sure you write them down in your orange booklet. And then make sure you go to Google Classroom to tell me your chapter titles. And tune in Thursday. Bye.